Okay. Hello, good evening. Welcome to University of London and the British Council. We share the building, so that's why I'm here. I'm Paul Doxty. I'm from the British Council here. And welcome to this debate this evening, which is one of a series on European politics. And tonight, I think, we have a real treat in store. We have Professor Phil Cowley, who will speak first, and then Professor Tim Bale will follow. Then we'll throw it open to questions. And then we have Jean-Pascal Sibier, who's not here. If Jean-Pascal arrives, he will do a reflection on the debate after the questions, and then we will all go and have a glass of wine. We might need it by the time we get there. Not because of the performance of our wonderful speakers, but we may be depressed by what we hear. I guess, like very, very many people in the UK, British people who were deeply concerned about the way the vote was going, I guess on the morning afterwards, some of us felt, how did that happen? We'd been scared witless in the weeks and days running up to the vote. And like Marcellus in Hamlet, we were thinking something's rotten in the state of Denmark, or state of the UK. And very quickly we began to think about something rotten in France, in Germany, in Spain. What's going on? Is there something rotten within our democracy, our much loved democracy? People like me were feeling, how did this happen? How could I have been asleep for so long? How could I not have seen this coming? And so a long period of reflection, which I'm not through yet, but you could say there's something rotten in the state of our democracy. This is not new. This is something which has been building. There's been a lot of discussion about this. We've heard a lot about an electorate that is increasingly disaffected. This is not something which happens on the 23rd of June. This is something which has been building up to that moment. We hear about the role of the media or the role of the internet. How does this affect politics today, and what does that do for democracy? Where does that leave us? Very worryingly for me, I was on the edge of tears, realizing I was living in a post-factual world. How could it be that the Enlightenment, that wonderful effervescence of intellectual thought in Europe that leads to looking at the world through evidence, an evidence-based approach to debate, the very way that we have our political discourse. And suddenly that seemed to have gone out the window. It seemed to be okay to lie unashamedly. We'd been warned by this by Peter Oborn, who had written his book on the rise of political lying. Very interesting book, but it looks so innocent now when you think about that book, 2005, in terms of what we saw during the referendum. So what's going on? We had lies given to us that people were prepared to vote for. And the experts were famously dismissed in a sentence. All of this is deeply concerning. And as I said, I think we need to ask the question, not only is there something rotten perhaps in the state of fill in the country, but maybe something deeply wrong with our democracy. And for me, a big question, which I'm hoping to get something of an answer to tonight, is the liberal elites, which I now know I am part of, We're paralysed by this. How do you debate with somebody who won't use facts, who won't engage in the rules that we've been following since these were developed in our intellectual history, hundreds of years ago? What might this mean for political discourse in the future, and what action is there for people like us? What do we do about this? So Phil Cowley is going to talk first about how we got there to that point, if I've understood. And Tim is then going to talk about what the consequences of that have been. And then, as I say, we throw it open to everybody. So Phil, over to you.
Thank you. That was the most depressing introduction I've ever had. Ever, I think. But thank you anyway. I feel that maybe was therapy for you. Yes. I'll bill you for it later. I'm not going to make any predictions in what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about the past, but I am going to be with one prediction, which is one of the few growth industries in Britain over the next few years that I can guarantee will be a growth industry, is books and articles examining the events of the 23rd of June. Two books have already come out. I know of another four books on the subject alone that are due out this month. I know of at least 6 academic papers on aspects of the voting, and that's before we actually get into the negotiations and so on. So in 15 minutes, I am going to scratch the surface of some of that and just offer a few insights, maybe deal with a couple of myths that I think are already developing around the Brexit referendum, and try and offer some food for discussion. The first issue, I think, is why we had the vote in the first place. One of the British newspapers recently ran a "Who is responsible for Brexit" sort of competition, and David Cameron won. The only thing he's won recently. And the logic was fairly straightforward. If silly old David Cameron hadn't agreed to have this referendum, we, by definition, could not have voted in a referendum to come out of the EU, and everything would be hunky-dory. And so sort of why was this man so foolish? Somehow he did this because he just needed to offer a sop to his backbench MPs or a sop to UKIP, the right of centre populist party in Britain. He should have just stood up to them and told them no. I think this is far too easy to say. It's just facile. David Cameron had no desire to have a referendum at all. He took office desperate not to have a referendum on the EU, and he fought his backbenchers privately and publicly on this issue for the first couple of years of the Parliament. And then he retreated because he had to retreat. Strength of feeling on his own backbenches was too strong, simply to face down, and the threat that he and the Conservative Party were facing from UKIP in the country was too strong. Bluntly, there is no way David Cameron would have won the 2015 election had he not offered a referendum earlier in the Parliament. Now, you might argue it would have been better, if you want to argue this, it would have been better for him not to have done that, lost office, and Britain to have remained in the European Union. But that's kind of not the way politics works, I think. You don't say, well, I'm going to lose this, so because he didn't think he was going to lose. Which brings me on to the next myth, I think. There was no plan for winning the referendum. There was a plan for winning the referendum. 2 things were supposed to happen. Spoiler alert, neither of these things happened, but 2 things were supposed to happen. The first was that after winning the election, David Cameron was supposed to come back from European negotiations with a deal. The nature of that deal was vague, but there would have been a deal which would, A, have allowed David Cameron to say, I have renegotiated our relationship with Europe in a way that is non-trivial, and B, would have somehow done something to allay the issue of immigration within British politics. He didn't come back with a deal that did either of those things. The deal that he emerged with was trivial, and one of the most striking things about the referendum campaign was the absence of that deal from almost any discussion. It was hardly ever mentioned in the referendum campaign, even though it had originally supposedly been a central part of what was going to happen. The second thing that was going to happen in the referendum was that it was going to all be about the economy. It was all going to be about the economic risks to Britain of leaving the EU. We were going to be scared to death about what might happen to the British economy. People would vote with their jobs, and it would be a double-digit victory for Remain. That didn't happen either. There is, I think, an associated myth, which is that when he agreed to put this promise for a referendum in the Conservative manifesto, he never intended to do it. He did it merely to shut his backbenchers up, and then he was going to enter into coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and he would trade away the agreement. This is still repeated in the media ad nauseum. This is completely wrong. It's completely wrong. It was one of the few red lines in the Conservative manifesto. It was one of the few things that in their private preparations for entering government in 2015, they were not prepared to negotiate away. And the reason for that, bluntly, is he would have been killed by his backbenchers had he done that. And it was something that the Liberal Democrats themselves were prepared to accept, and privately have said were prepared to accept in those negotiations. So it was going to happen. It was going to happen. Now, then we get on to what happened. And I have to say, I was doing BBC Radio 4 all night on referendum night. I was analysing the results. You say you were close to tears by the morning. I was just exhausted by the morning. But professionally, it was the most exciting night of my life. I'm very happy to admit that. I mean, you were commentating on history in the making in a way that was on a greater scale than I've done election night, normal election night, and this was just on a sort of different level. But despite it being exciting, actually for most of the night, I was next to useless. I was in the studio all night as the results came in. And I think the reason for that I'll explain in a minute. I probably should say why it was exciting. And it was exciting not just because of the scale, actually. It was exciting because it was unexpected. Most of the final opinion polls had predicted a Remain victory, so most people had gone into the studios that night expecting Remain to win. One pollster predicted a Remain victory with 10 percentage points. I mean, it wasn't going to be close. By 10 p.m. when the polls closed, you could get odds of 10 to 1 for Leave winning. You put down 100 quid, and you'd have had 1,000 quid. Now, very few people did that, I can assure you. And in fact, several people in the Leave camp by now, including Nigel Farage, were privately conceding defeat. We know from polling that Tim and I did as well, MPs similarly thought Remain were going to win all along. Now, those of you that were watching the results on the night will know that the very first place to declare was Gibraltar. That's going to be a pub quiz question for years to come. Gibraltar was 96% for Remain. We were not placing too much weight on Gibraltar in the studios. But the first two proper places to declare were Newcastle and Sunderland in the northeast of England. And as soon as those two came in, it was clear that at best this was going to be for Leave. For Remain, this was going to be close. But actually, both performances in Newcastle and Sunderland were on a scale that, if replicated elsewhere, were going to be a Leave win. Newcastle was in the BBC's top 35 pro-Remain places in the UK, and it only just scraped a Remain win. So very quickly in the night, this is why I became useless, I think, it became really obvious that Leave had won. Now, one of the oddities of the referendum result was that the places in Britain declared in local authority council areas. So they declared in places of very different sizes, from the Isles of Scilly, which has a population of 2,000, up to Birmingham, which has a population of 1.1 million. So Birmingham declares as one unit, the Isles of Scilly declares one unit, and lots of places in between declare as one unit, which makes analysis of the results quite tricky because you've got these very different spatial areas. But you can map using a variety of techniques onto normal-sized parliamentary constituencies. And if you do that, you discover that in about 2/3 of the constituencies in Britain, the majority of people voted to leave. So this is, I'll talk about the geographic mapping of this in a minute, but this was a fairly widespread, although it's 52-48 nationally, there is a majority in 2/3 of Britain for this. And the result became pretty clear pretty early on in the night, and therefore if you're there supposedly to analyse the results, and it's pretty obvious what's happened, you become redundant. You just sit in the studio as politicians looking shell-shocked come in and do their thing and move out. Now, a couple more myths, I think, about the results. The first is that a myth has sort of grown up about some bifurcation in Britain. If you looked at the results, a majority in Scotland voted to stay in, a majority in London voted to stay in, a majority in Northern Ireland voted to stay in, majorities everywhere else voted out. But it's worth remembering that almost all of those splits are at worst 60-40, and in many cases less than 60-40. So this idea that up there in Scotland everyone was for Remain and in England everyone was for out, it's just not true. You're talking gradations across Britain. Sure, more Remain in Scotland, more Remain in London and Northern Ireland. But if you bump into a Scot, for example, of those who did vote, roughly 6 in 10 voted to Remain and 4 in 10 voted out. If you bump into someone from the West Midlands, it's roughly the opposite way round. But there are substantial minorities in all the bits of the UK. The diversity is slightly stronger at the constituency level, so you go to Boston and Skegness in Lincolnshire, 75% of people voted out. You go to Hornsey and Wood Green in North London, 82% of people voted Remain. But even amongst the constituencies, most places are somewhere more in the middle than that. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about this result to somehow pretend that everyone in London is some part of some sort of metropolitan liberal elite who wanted to stay in the EU, and everyone in the West Midlands is some sort of knuckle-dragging Neanderthal who wanted Britain to leave. It's actually much, much more complicated than that. The second thing, and this was touched on in the introduction, is about the sort of idea of fear-mongering and scaremongering, myths and lies and so on. And I think it's certainly true that there was quite a lot of fear-mongering and scaremongering and myths and lies knocking around during the referendum. But both sides were at it. There was no one side that had a monopoly on lying or fear-mongering. And actually, if either side ran a negative campaign, probably the most negative campaign was the Remain campaign. It was unremittingly negative. It was all about the terrible things that will happen if Britain leaves the European Union. There was almost never a positive message about the advantages of being in the EU. And bluntly, the reason for this is that when they tested this in focus groups, the Remain campaign, they discovered it just bombed. It had absolutely no cut-through with British people, a positive message about the EU. I ran a polling experiment during the referendum where I discovered that if you told people, this was at a time when Remain had a comfortable lead in the opinion polls, if you told people we can come out of the EU and you will be no worse off financially, you instantly had a majority for leave. So the majority for Remain at that point was entirely constructed on the fact that people thought they would be worse off if they left. So A, there was probably more fear-mongering done by Remain than by Leave, and B, Remain didn't have much strategic choice. The third myth I think is growing up is about who voted for Leave. There are some really obvious social and educational and age gradients. As you go, in quotes, up the social spectrum from working class to middle class and so on, you find people much more likely to vote to Remain. As you go up the educational ladder, higher levels of education, people are much more likely to vote Remain. And as you go up the age bracket, people are much more likely to vote Leave. And they're really quite striking in all cases. The single strongest one is the educational one. The difference between people without a degree, people with no formal education beyond 16 and people with master's education is stronger than any other social demographic split. Now, having said all of this, there is a contra myth to this, which is that there was some sort of middle class revolt going on. Newsnight, the political affairs program in Britain, ran a piece recently on how it was really the middle class, the English middle class, who voted to leave. And their logic was that 59% of all Leave voters were middle class people. And this is true. 59% of all middle class, 59% of all Leave voters were middle class. If you bump into a Leave voter in the street and you know nothing else about that person, they are likely to be middle class. But that's because most people in Britain are middle class. It was a sort of completely spurious exercise. 67% of the people who voted in the referendum, according to the usual social demographic splits, are middle class. So it is not at all surprising that the majority of Leave voters are middle class. The majority of Remain voters were middle class as well. The majority of Leave voters were Southern, because there's more people in the south than the north. The majority of Remain voters were Southern because there's more people in the south than the north. These are not difficult concepts. Quite how it got onto Newsnight is beyond me. One of the things I think, however, is really interesting about the referendum result is why the odds at the bookies of 10 to 1 were so out of kilter with reality. 10 to 1 in a two-horse race is an astonishing position. You would never get that on a horse race with only two horses running. And yes, the most recent polls, just before the results began to announce, had predicted a Remain win, but not all of them. There had been plenty in the weeks before showing Leave comfortably ahead. And so even if we thought Remain was likely, we should never have thought it was 10 to 1 likely. There was plenty of evidence from the polling of Leave messages cutting through. I mean, if you look at the messages from the campaign that had real cut-through with voters, they're almost all Leave messages. Whether they're true or not is a different matter, but they're all Leave messages. You go back and watch some of the televised debates now, and it is striking how Leave basically trounced Remain time after time after time. They had a message discipline that the Remain camp lacked, and they had a simpler message. They had a clear vernacular message about the benefits of leaving the EU, taking control, stop sending money to the EU, controlling immigration. Remain had no message to counter that at all. They had a series of caveats. We know you don't like the EU, but we know immigration is a problem, but, and so on. And that is a really weak campaign message. And I think what's interesting about this from an academic perspective, looking back on it, is how I think we all deep down thought Remain would win, really. Even when Leave were ahead in the polls, we kind of didn't think that would happen. We thought people would, however tempted they would pull back at the last. Now, partly, I think this is because we'd all read lots of stuff about status quo bias, which is a well-known phenomenon in constitutional referenda. Voters are tempted by change, then they look at the risks of change, status quo is safer, so they revert to the status quo. But A, status quo bias has never been quite as strong as some people made out. And B, one of the things that the Leave camp did brilliantly in the referendum was kill the status quo option. They spent a lot of time saying that this was not a choice between things as they were now and a risky path exiting the EU. This was a choice between two risks. One was an EU which was still developing, where there was going to be a European army, where Turkey was going to join the EU. If Turkey joined the EU, there was going to be mass migration via Turkey into the EU, and look where that would come from. And by doing that, they took the status quo option off the table. They presented voters with two risky choices, two risky futures. But I think there's a deeper problem here. There was an expert predictions exercise in Britain where some academics went and asked academics, journalists, other experts what they thought was likely to happen. And of the academics, politics academics, supposedly the experts, 87% thought that Britain would remain in the EU. Of the journalists, political journalists, the people who were writing about this, 97% thought that Britain was going to stay in the EU. More than that, 9 out of 10 university staff wanted Britain to stay in the EU. And I think there was an extent to which the commentators on this, the political class, including the academics, were basically out of touch with what was happening in the country. And I have to say, I live in Lambeth, which is the most pro-Remain place in the UK. And Lambeth released ward-level data on this, and I live in the most pro-Remain ward, in the most pro-Remain place in the UK. So I'm not exempting myself from this at all, but we often talk about how social media can lead to an echo chamber in which we just talk to each other, without realising sometimes that we can all live perfectly happily in natural echo chambers of our own, in which we never encounter people with contrary opinions. And I think you see too much of this in the post-match analysis. So there is a lot at the moment about how ill-informed British voters were, and sure, there's plenty of evidence that voters were pretty ill-informed. But Remain voters were just as ill-informed as Leave voters. Nobody has a monopoly on this. Lots of the people voting Remain knew absolutely nothing about the issues, but we somehow don't think that's a problem because they were voting the way we sort of think they should. And actually the British public had made, and they made it a few years ago, they had made a connection between levels of immigration that they thought were too high and Britain's membership of the EU. And they had made the intellectual connection between those two things, and one of the reasons that Remain struggled during this campaign was the argument which said, if we stay in the EU, we cannot control our borders, was an unanswerable intellectual argument. It wasn't made up, it wasn't false, it was true. And that was particularly difficult for Remain because they were fighting against a public who thought that levels of immigration were too high. Now maybe they're wrong to think that, but they think that. And I think you see it similarly in discussion about, which you see a lot of in Britain, about discussion of buyer's remorse. The idea that out there are just millions of people who regret their decision, and if we had a second referendum, it would come out with a different result. And it's just rubbish. For one thing, there is no evidence of widespread buyer's remorse. There are some people who voted Leave who now regret it and wish they voted Remain, but there are actually more people who voted Remain and regret it and wish they voted Leave. There is no evidence that the British public, now at least, and in general, somehow thinks they made the wrong decision. And if there is a second referendum on this topic, my suspicion is it would be won by Leave, even more convincingly than the first one was won by Leave, for at least two reasons. The first would be that everyone hates a bad loser, and if we drag the public back to the polls, having already asked them once what they think, I don't think they will like it very much. But the second is that the Conservative Party would now be almost entirely united around a Leave vote. The heuristic for Conservative voters of the Conservative Party wanting Britain to stay in the EU, at least officially, the Conservative Prime Minister wanting Britain to stay in the EU, will have gone. Now those two things combined make me think that any second referendum would be even more of a Leave vote now than it was on the 23rd of June. And at that point, I will happily pass over to Tim.
Thank you, Phil. That actually is a very good place to pass over to me because I wanted to begin by talking about the Conservative Party and where it is right now in the Conservative government. I spent Monday and Tuesday at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham and just doing some fringe events and getting a sense of the mood there. It was not just among Eurosceptics, it has to be said, or hard Eurosceptics, people who wanted to leave the European Union, but among the majority, I think, of Conservatives, euphoric. And there was a kind of feeling of optimism there that some would say borders on the delusional. Now, why do I say that? There is a very strong feeling that because the UK has so far suffered no economic ill consequences other than a very, very big devaluation in our currency, which of course can be seen in positive terms for exports, that there will be no negative consequences ever of Brexit. There is a feeling, and it is explicitly stated, that the EU needs the UK every bit as much, if not more, than the UK needs the EU. There is a feeling that other countries all around the world are positively queuing up to do trade deals with us, which will, of course, be advantageous to us. And there is a very strong sense in general, really, of the UK in the future, as Boris Johnson once put it, being, pro-cake and pro-eating cake. In other words, we are going to be able to square circles. We are going to be able to have our cake and eat it, as the phrase goes. In other words, the Conservative Party at the moment is in a very sort of Panglossian mood. This is the all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. It is, in fact, interestingly, very, very difficult, really, to find anyone in the Conservative Party, even in the Parliamentary Party, where there was a majority for Remain, who is actually any longer identifiably, visibly, tangibly not a leaver. In other words, it reminded me very strongly of a country that's been under occupation and has now been liberated, where everybody claimed to be fighting for the resistance during the occupation. There is a very, very small minority of Conservative politicians who are putting their head above the parapet to say, hang on a minute, we're being unrealistic, and trying to call out the government and indeed their own party on some of what I've been talking about before. But we really are seriously only talking about a handful of politicians. You can name them. In fact, it's less than a handful. It's a hand without a thumb, actually. It's Anna Soubry, it's Nicky Morgan, who used to be on the front bench, Nick Herbert as well, and somebody called Neil Carmichael, who heads up the kind of very tiny, Conservatives for Europe movement. Apart from them, there really is no one at all. And they are in a very, very difficult position because, as Phil implies, anyone who speaks out against Brexit is seen as a sore loser and can now be accused of actually talking down Britain and talking down the economy if they point out any risks that exist. They are also facing a bit of a tactical dilemma, really. Do they compromise and focus their efforts on trying to get what is now being referred to as a soft Brexit? In other words, a situation in which we get as close as possible, whether it's membership or whether it's simply access to the single market, instead of a hard Brexit, which would be actually leaving the single market and having anything to do with the single market, having anything to do with the customs union completely. Do they do that, or do they somehow kind of plant the flag on the other side and say, we should not leave the European Union, we made a terrible mistake, there should be a second referendum, we really need to think again in order to try and sort of anchor the pro-European case so far to one side that the centre of gravity in the party and the government doesn't get dragged even further towards a hard Brexit. At the moment, at least if you look at those politicians and the people around them, they seem to be going for the first option. In other words, there isn't much appetite for arguing for us never leaving, for a second referendum. It's all about, as far as they're concerned now, just trying to get their colleagues interested in a soft rather than a hard Brexit. The only people who are really going for the second option, trying to kind of plant the flag, if you like, for a second referendum and for not leaving, is an organisation like the European Movement, which has very, very little traction anywhere, let alone in the Conservative Party or the government, despite the fact, maybe because of the fact, that it's currently headed up by an ex-Conservative MP. There are some ministerial tensions within the government, it has to be said. mainly, I think, in the long term, around a division between, if you like, the kind of neoliberal, Ayn Rand strand of the Conservative Party, who would like to use Brexit as a way of pushing the United Kingdom into an even more Anglo-Saxon, deregulated, liberal welfare state and economy than we already have. The people, if you like, who look across the Atlantic and see as a model for the British economy the American economy, easy hire and fire, dynamic labour market, etc., etc. They're on the one side, and on the other side are those, and I think we'd have to include the Prime Minister in this second group, who are rather more centrist, who do believe that there is a role for government, and in some ways are more mercantilist, if anything, than they are liberals in terms of international trade. So there is a tension there, but there are also some more immediate tensions, particularly over, for example, whether EU citizens currently living in the UK will be allowed to live and work without hindrance for the future. David Davis, who is the Minister for Brexit, has said that he is 100% sure that those rights will be granted to people living in the UK. He doesn't give a date for that. Presumably it will be the night of the referendum or the day after the referendum, who knows. But he seems to be fairly convinced that that will be the case and that should be the case. But you have another of the so-called three Brexiteers, Davis, Fox and Johnson, and in this case Liam Fox, who made it very clear a couple of days ago that he sees those people as cards in the negotiation game. In other words, as bargaining chips that we should use in any negotiation with the EU. So there is a major spat, I think, waiting to happen there. There's also, I think, a division between those people in the Conservative government who think it is extremely important that we ensure that our financial services industry and indeed our manufacturing industry are allowed to operate on the continent without tariffs, with, in the case of the city, full passporting rights. In that group, one has to include the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Phil Hammond, who is very much a realist, if you like, on all this, and was in some ways out of kilter with the rest of the party and the rest of the party's minister when he was making his speech to the conference, because he did emphasise that, you know, there would be some difficult times ahead, and that he was concerned to make sure that we had as full access as possible. But on the other hand, there are people in the Conservative government, in cabinet, and maybe even Theresa May, who thinks that the loss of access to the single market may be a price worth paying for regaining our liberty, our sovereignty, and in particular for regaining control, as they say, over the nation's borders. Now, I have heard in recent weeks, you know, this idea that somehow the Treasury will no longer be so important, and that therefore Hammond is bound to lose this argument. I would take that with a huge pinch of salt. I think that the British governance, being what it is and being what it has been, it is very difficult to imagine the Treasury losing the kind of control and the kind of traction it generally has had, and I think probably still has, at the top in Britain. I think Treasury arguments weigh awfully heavily with ministers, and will weigh heavily even with ministers who might be inclined to be in that second, if you like, harder Brexit group. I've heard so many times before over the years that, you know, the Treasury is losing its power. I'm not so sure that is the case. I think there are some fundamental economic arguments that it will make that will convince many of Hammond's colleagues. And there may be some influence on the part of the Conservative Party's backers in the City of London and elsewhere in finance capital in the UK, that weigh upon ministers' decisions and Mrs May's decisions on that. But nevertheless, it has to be said, going back to the first point, the Conservative Party basically cannot wait till Theresa May triggers Article 50 before March of next year. This is a Conservative Party that sees absolutely no prospect whatsoever of a second referendum, or even contemplates any chance of a sort of parliamentary veto over us leaving. Now, my own view is, I think, in keeping with Phil's, that even if public opinion were to change pretty drastically, and it could do if everything goes very badly wrong, it would be difficult to imagine a Conservative government willing to relitigate this. It's possible because, of course, MPs listen to the public on occasions, but I think very difficult to imagine. What's also interesting is that there's a lot of enthusiasm, and I can't quite see why, for what is being called at the moment the Great Repeal Act, which is interesting because in some ways it will declare that the status quo as we currently have it with regard to the influence of European law on our own law will be the default option. In other words, it will be for Parliament to go in and unpick those things that it doesn't like, rather than getting rid of everything and then adding them back in. It's interesting that the Conservatives seem to have bought that, and we can discuss that at greater length. What there is then is a feeling that basically any obstacle can be overcome through goodwill and through the force of will. Even, for example, a very tricky problem like Northern Ireland and the border with Britain there. If we want to control immigration, can we still do that with a soft border between the UK and the North? The assumption from the Conservative government is, yes, we can, but they haven't really explained quite how we are going to be able to do that. So that's one to watch. The Conservatives aren't unduly worried either now about Scotland, and I think I've got some sympathy with that. We know that Scotland should have a say in the negotiations with the EU, but we're not quite sure how it's going to have that say. There doesn't seem to me to be much risk of a second independence referendum anytime soon, simply because I think the SNP has woken up to the fact that the economy being what it is, the risks of Brexit being what they are, actually they couldn't win it. And there's no way the SNP is going to hold a referendum that it can't win a second time anyway. And anyway, the EU would be a big issue in that referendum, and I'm not sure that would help the SNP win. In fact, if you remember, as Phil said, that 40% of people in Scotland voted to leave the EU. You don't really want to be mixing up those two issues if you want independence for Scotland. And anyway, to be honest, the Scottish government's probably got more things immediately to worry about, like maintaining or replacing the funding that it gets currently from the EU, from the UK government. I don't even think now that the Conservative Party is particularly worried by UKIP. Organisationally, UKIP is in chaos. In some ways, it's lost its raison d'etre because we are leaving the European Union. And I think the Conservatives now see UKIP in some senses as a challenge to be won rather than a threat to be feared. I think that many Conservatives think that around half of the 10% of people who say currently that they'd vote for UKIP if there were an election tomorrow can be persuaded to come home to the Conservative Party. Many of them actually previously were Conservative voters, or might have been the kind of people who would vote Conservative. And it's very clear that Mrs May, in addition to whatever else she's doing in terms of positioning the Conservative Party, is actually trying to bring those people back home through some of the measures she's announced, both in terms of immigration and Brexit, and also in terms of, for example, grammar schools and selective education. That said, I think there still is room for a populist radical right party in the UK, and I don't think immigration is going to go away as an issue in UK politics. So there's room there, especially for a party that's willing to mobilise on Islamophobic grounds, something that the Conservative Party probably will not choose to do. And also there is a role possibly for UKIP in holding the government's feet to the fire on Brexit once inevitably compromises have to be made with the EU. But there is also a conservative ginger group, Leave Means Leave, which has every intention of doing the same. I don't either think that the government is particularly concerned about the 48% of people who voted to remain in the European Union for a number of reasons. The first is that many people who voted for us remaining in the European Union are actually conservative voters. Okay, they're middle class, they're educated, they're well off. They'll probably carry on voting Conservative. We'll go into some of the reasons why in a moment. And some of the people, of course, who voted to stay in the European Union are also young voters who voted in quite surprising numbers, given what most commentators were forecasting beforehand in terms of turnout. Many of those won't bother coming out at a general election next time around, so why would the Conservative Party worry about them? The other reason is because a lot of those 48% have got nowhere else to go. Why haven't they got anywhere else to go? Well, the Lib Dems at the moment are still in sackcloth and ashes after the 2010-2015 period. They're slowly trying to rebuild at a local level, but they're not really seen as a sort of serious option for many people at the moment. That may change, but I doubt it will change in the next 3-4 years. And anyway, the Liberal Democrats have got to be very careful about situating their appeal simply in terms of that 48%, particularly given the kind of places that the Liberal Democrats have to win next time around, the seats that they lost to the Conservatives in 2015. It wouldn't be wise to portray themselves as a sort of party nostalgic for the EU and desperate to get back into it. That's not going to work for them. Voters haven't got anywhere else to go either because the Labour Party is, frankly, a joke at the moment, and not even a very good joke, to be honest. Its leader, apart from having very little appeal to the average voter, floating voter, is not particularly a convinced European, as we all know. So is in not really any position to hold the government to account on this. He sees, like many old leftists, the EU as a kind of capitalist club, as a kind of colonialist, neoliberal oppressor of small, brave countries led by left-wing parties like Syriza, etc. And there is a distinct absence of anyone else serving on the front bench in the Labour Party who is capable of holding the government to account on anything they do on Europe. So we have really an opposition that is disappeared. And that means, to begin to wind up, that we are in a pretty dreadful, in some ways, situation in the UK. We have a non-existent opposition, which means, the government doesn't have to look over its shoulder when it's negotiating and perhaps won't be challenged in a way that any good government should be challenged to think about what it's doing. We have an overly confident, even complacent, I think, government, which doesn't really know what it wants yet from the negotiations, but is convinced utterly that it can get it, even though it doesn't know what it wants, which is an interesting position to be in. And we have a public which, not unusually, wants the moon on a stick, as we say in the UK, wants its cake and eat it, and might well be quite disappointed when, as is almost inevitable, it doesn't get it. Having said that, however, to coin the cliche, I do think Brexit means Brexit. We are leaving the European Union. We will leave the European Union. It's now just about the terms upon which we do exit the European Union. For many people, I think this will, just be about making the best of what they consider to be a bad job, especially if they are in the liberal elite. But because the government is what it is and is the way it is and is responding in the way it is to the Brexit vote and the messages it thinks it got from that Brexit vote, I'm not entirely confident, he says, to end on a low note, that we'll even manage to do that, to make the best of a bad job. I think we might make the worst of a bad job. There we go.
Thank you both. That was stimulating and, you said, much more uplifting than what I had to say at the beginning. I'd like to start, if I may, the questions. You've talked, both of you, about referendums and the fact that we are very unlikely to see a second referendum. I agree with that. I don't think we will see a second referendum. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily want that. But the last time I looked, and I did check just before I came here, we're a parliamentary democracy. And I think there is a concern around about what the future might hold for that parliamentary democracy, which there is a sense, people will say, that it's not quite fit for purpose. We have the single biggest decision that our country has taken for many, many, many years, taken by a referendum. We have a Labour Party opposition imploding, and we've got the Scottish nationalists having just about every seat there is available in Scotland. It's very, very different, and it feels very different, but it's still a parliamentary democracy. And so I would ask both of you, actually, maybe if you could just say a few words about how you think that might pan out for us in the next while. Do we get a vote? Is there any kind of democratic accountability exercised about what that Brexit what those Brexit terms will be, and how will that come about? Or is it simply that we have, Kim Jong-may running the government, as you say, it's becoming unopposed at the moment?
Well, we sort out your microphone. I think there is a really interesting question in terms of the British model of government, because the British model of government always used to be what is crudely called the Westminster model, and it's a sort of top-down, for good or ill, it's a top-down form of government in which we elect a government. That government, by and large, can do what it likes for however long it's in office, and then we hold it accountable at the end of that period of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And it was a form of government that didn't include use of referenda. It was a form of government in which, for all its flaws, at least at the end of it, you knew there was a form of accountability. That was one of its strengths, was you could, to use the vernacular, kick the bastards out at the end. So, and here is an issue with the referendum. We had it. Now, in some ways, it fits perfectly within the parliamentary democracy because it was Parliament that decided to do this. By 6-1, MPs voted for the Referendum Act. They voted to hand this decision over to voters. And yes, it's because it's a parliamentary democracy, formally the referendum wasn't binding. Formally, it was advisory. But in practical terms, nobody thought that. I mean, once you give voters the decision on things like this, you have to then accept what voters say. I don't think there will have to be a vote at some point on the terms of a deal, and it will be within Parliament. But it will be on the terms of the deal after Article 50 has been triggered. There is not going to be a vote in Parliament on whether or not to trigger Article 50. As far as the government is concerned, that decision has been taken. It was taken by the voters, and the government is now going to enact that decision. I don't know if Tim wants to.
There is going to be, I believe, an attempt to challenge in court, isn't there? The government going ahead with this, and I think that's going to take place on the 13th of October. So you might want to watch the news for that. I think it's one of those things that legal academics and maybe some lawyers have some confidence, could work, but I suspect in the real world, it probably won't. I suspect that whatever the legal reasoning, it will be extremely difficult, I think, for any judges to resist the argument that this is the will of the people, and it would be politically very, very risky, I think, for the judiciary to be seen to be undoing or going against that. It might be that they can resist that kind of pressure. I have my doubts about that. So I think Phil's absolutely right. I think they will be able to argue that this is a prerogative power, and that it isn't actually down to Parliament to vote on it. That's the Article 50. I think Phil's right that there will be a vote maybe down the line on the deal, and it may be then that the government does have to look over its shoulder at some of its backbenchers and think about how it can get that deal through. But then it will probably be able to rely on some people in other parties anyway, voting or abstaining in order to be able to get it through. So I don't suspect that there will be any problem. And of course we're assuming right now that Theresa May is absolutely correct when she says there won't be an election until 2020. It could well be that there is an election earlier and she has a 3-figure majority, in which case it probably would be easier anyway to get that through.
Okay, so over to you.
Yes, for the first speaker, you mentioned the status quo, and I was just wondering if anyone had actually looked into, as a sort of post-referendum analysis, what the effect of people, also the fact of the opinion polls being very much in favour of Remain, what would be the sort of proportion of people who themselves made the analysis that, it'll be the status quo, and therefore combined with the very sort of positive opinion polls just said, well, I don't have to go and vote because it's going to be all right anyway. A sort of complacency effect.
Well, there is some evidence that there are some voters who didn't vote who think they should have voted, but and regret not voting. But there's no evidence that there's enough to have made the difference in terms of the outcome of the referendum. And whilst it's true that the polls immediately before the vote showed Remain winning, you only have to go back about a week, and there were plenty of polls showing Leave 2, 3, 4 points ahead. So it's not, I think, true. I mean, in fact, one of the puzzles is quite why in the final week everybody thought, oh, well, that's done and dusted then. Because if you looked over the month before, there were dozens of polls showing Leave ahead. One of the interesting questions is whether actually Leave were ahead all along, given that the final polls were out of kilter with reality. And part of the reason we think they might have been is that there is some evidence that, although some people stayed at home because they were complacent, there is some evidence that turnout rose quite sharply in areas that normally have quite low turnout. So particularly working class Labour areas where turnout traditionally is low, partly because they're in safe seats and partly because they're Labour working class areas where working class voters turn out on a lower rate than middle class voters anyway. Some of these places saw increases of turnout of 10, 12, 13% from the general election a year or so before. And overwhelmingly, these were Leave voters. These were Leave voters these were voters in general who had largely disengaged from the formal political process, hadn't voted in some cases for 1 or 2 or even more elections, and were re-energized by the prospect of voting in the referendum. So whilst I've no doubt there were some voters, we know from polls there are some voters who regret it because they think they should have voted, and particularly young voters where turnout rates are low. There were even more voters who were energized by the prospect of voting and who re-engaged with the political process.
Introducing myself, I'm Andrew Lyndon-Skeggs, and I can say from the outset I voted for Brexit, which evidently makes me very old and very badly educated. So yes, I did vote for Brexit, and therefore, contrary to the introduction, I was not a yes at the end of the referendum. I was absolutely delighted, and I personally think it gives us huge scope for the future. I do hope that we come out of the customs union so that we can trade with the rest of the world. I do not like, and for me it's one of the most important parts of the whole thing, I do not like being stuck into a little gang like Europe and told we cannot speak to, i.e. talk trade with the rest of the world. I think England should be trading, should be talking to everyone, not just one little gang. With the introductions we've had so far, because I vote Brexit, everything seems to be swimming along quite nicely and seems to be reasonably positive and extremely interesting, until the very last sentence, which leaves us sort of poised on a cliff's edge, saying there's a real danger that we may make the worst mess of the worst job. Catastrophe. Can you expand on that?
That one's for me, yes.
I think so.
Yeah. I am not sure that there was ever quite the zero sum between Britain's ability to trade with the rest of the world and our membership of the single market that you assume there was. I actually am fairly convinced that we stood much more chance of getting positive trade agreements with other larger countries as part of a bigger trading bloc than we are or going to be able to do as a single country. Partly because obviously, you know, having more weight helps you in negotiations, and partly because one of the problems we're going to have is actually building up the institutional capacity to do those deals. So that's one reason. The other reason is because some of the countries that we probably can quite quickly get trade deals with are very small, Australia and New Zealand being the obvious examples. Some of the countries with which I think we will find it much harder to get deals with, at least to our advantage anyway, I'm thinking particularly India, which could be a big market, I think is going to be a very difficult one to break. And I think it will be just as difficult, if not more difficult, for the UK as it will be for the EU. My other concern, I think, is, and this does reflect a concern, I think, in the Conservative government, and Philip Hammond's a good example of this, is that there will be an unwillingness to invest in the UK on the part of some companies who previously have invested in the UK on the assumption that we would have full access to the single market. That, I think, is worrying. We're beginning to see signs of that. For example, if you look at the remarks of the chairman of Nissan. I do take your point, though. I think it is obviously the case, since we are going to be leaving, that you know, we do have to take a positive and optimistic attitude in some ways, because if we don't, we really will be in trouble. So, I mean, my analysis is based on, I guess, what I would see as sort of short and medium-term problems. A slightly deeper problem for me, as someone who, you know, unlike you, voted Remain, is that I think there will be an opportunity cost, but it will be very, very difficult to measure. We'll never know, in some senses, what that alternative future in the EU will be. So it is almost certain that those people who favoured leave, unless things go terribly badly wrong, will be able to say it's worked, because they'll be arguing against something that, you know, is an unknowable. What would it have been like if we stayed in the EU? Now, as someone interested in argument, I think that's a problem. But actually, that's academic, literally. And it's important simply that we get on and we try and make it work. I'm just not sure that we'll do as well, and certainly as quickly as some people think, that's all. I think in the long term, you know, the sky won't fall in.
Actually, I'm going to pick up on your comments right at the beginning about your voting. I mean, obviously, in all of these demographic breakdowns, there are significant minorities who do not vote the same way. And that was the point I was trying to make about Scotland, for example. Not all voting to Remain is part of that. But let's just take social class. I'm going to take a stab in the dark, just a random stab in the dark, and guess that you're social class A, B. And you can beat me up later if I'm wrong. Well, you wouldn't, because you're social class AB. 57% of social class AB voted to remain. Of graduates, a majority voted to remain. Of those with postgraduate education, which may or may not be you, but of those with postgraduate education, 2/3 voted to remain. Now, where it gets trickier and more personal so is with your age, because that's tougher and always rude to ask. But of those aged 65 and over, which you may well not be, but of those aged 65 and over, 40% voted to remain. So it could be that you're just an outlier, or it could be that your age trumps your class. And that's where we'll end the conversation.
Hi. Yeah. The other interesting thing that you said was, instead of saying Britain or the UK, you said England. And one of the other drivers, or at least correlates with Leave voting, was identification with England rather than Britain. It's something that Phil might want to talk about a little bit more, but certainly, this was a vote that, not primarily, but certainly had a lot to do with identity. And of course, this is something that we're all struggling with across Europe, but we're struggling with in particular in the UK.
Hi, Jean-Pascal Thibier, Franco-British Connections. The UK leaving Europe, will there be some kind of, in your opinion, of cultural vacuum, a lack of Anglo-Saxon cultural influence in the EU? And could we, for instance, expect that the British Council and other cultural bodies would reinvest, culturally speaking, in the EU?
Well, I think that's for you. I reckon you'll survive. I reckon we'll survive as well. But I think the idea that France is going to be, culturally a cultural desert because Britain leaves the EU, I suspect this is not true. But I think it's probably more for you.
I think I agree with that. I think the British Council's role is very much a kind of facilitation role or an interventionist role to sort of make things happen perhaps more quickly than they would otherwise, or perhaps not at all. And yeah, that will continue. And I think I see some benefits, actually. One is that there will be a greater emphasis, in my view, on bilateral relations rather than trying to think across a region, in this case, the EU. And that could be a good thing because it will be easier to put resources. So your resource question, yes, I think there will be more investment, and it will go to those countries that matter to the UK in terms of the connections that we have through culture and education. So I could see that as being quite a positive. But the bottom line is that the British Council is all about speaking people to people, and if we are floating off in some way, then you could argue there's a need for that more than ever. So yeah, we're still here. We're going to be here.
Yeah.
So I should out myself as a German who lives in the UK. I've had no sort of role in this vote. I'm really concerned about what will happen to public opinion as you do start engaging with the EU in these negotiations. So the question I've got is, until now, for a very long time, Brussels was kind of a very useful scapegoat, and a large proportion of your media was invested in using that scapegoat day in, day out for all sorts of reasons. I have the feeling a lot of people got away with writing lots of copy very easily because they could always fall back on this if they couldn't come up with something else. Now that's going to disappear at some stage, and the question is, what takes its place? Are you going to go back to older sort of bugbears? Are they going to be, is it Berlin that's going to come back? What is going to be the thing that people will focus on, if you like, if they realize that they can't have what they might be hoping to get?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question, because I think we are going to realize, just as other countries within the EU, Greece being the obvious example, Italy being another example, Spain, Ireland, that actually when we talk about Brussels, in the end we're talking about other governments we're not talking about this thing called the EU, in other words. And we are going to be faced, I think, with the reality that, it's Angela Merkel, it's whoever succeeds François Hollande. If Renzi manages to survive his own referendum, Renzi, etc., it will be these people, in some senses, that we are negotiating with, rather than this faceless bureaucratic body that it's so easy to bash. Now, whether they will therefore replace, and whether their capitals will therefore replace Brussels, in the demonology, it's difficult to know. I think there is a severe risk, as you seem to hint, actually, that there will be other scapegoats, and migrants are the obvious one for that, and I think that is quite worrying. On the other hand, at least for the Conservative Party anyway, I do think there is an upside of Brexit, and that is that, in the long term, once we've left and once the dust has settled, and that could take quite a long time, it will actually mean the Conservative Party has to start thinking hard again about all the kind of serious problems in the economy and society in Britain that it hasn't really preoccupied itself with for so long, because it's been so damn obsessed with the European Union. And that might actually be a good thing in some ways, if a British government would kind of turn in on itself positively and think about what the problems are in British society. Productivity in the economy is one obvious one. We do face a housing crisis, and that isn't too strong a word for the situation in the UK. We face, again, a crisis is not too strong a word, a crisis in adult social care. There are all sorts of bread and butter issues that in some senses the Conservative Party, should have thought harder about and needs to think harder about. And in some ways, Theresa May is beginning, I think, to do that. But that's one of the upsides of Brexit, I think.
It's a similar argument, really, in Scotland. If you speak to people in the SNP about anti-English sentiment in Scotland, one of their arguments is that if Scotland left the United Kingdom, Scotland would have to sort of grow up a bit. That would be part of the process of becoming independent, but it would no longer blame the bloody English for everything. I have to say, I've always been a bit sceptical of that as an argument. I mean, I suspect that they would still carry on blaming the English for everything. They'd just be an independent nation blaming the English for everything. And I suspect the same may well be, I mean, your fear may well be true, that denied the bogeyman that we can blame for everything. Who do we blame when things go wrong? But there is a caveat, which is if they go wrong. And it's a big if, and I don't claim to know the answer. One of the interesting things about public opinion in Britain, I think, at the moment is that, and one of the reasons, another reason maybe why there would be no victory if there was a second referendum, or a different result if there was a second referendum, is, of course, the British public were told lots of terrible things would happen if Britain voted to leave the EU. And before anyone says, yes, but we haven't left yet, they were told they would happen immediately. I mean, they were told they would have, the day after a vote, these awful things would happen. George Osborne would have to bring in a budget to raise taxes, house prices would plummet, World War III would break out. All of this would happen immediately, Britain, and of course it didn't. And so the public is still, I think, waiting to see. Now, my suspicion is by the time things either go badly or go well, depending on what happens, the sort of line of accountability between the vote happening and what's now happening will be so blurred that there will be no linkage made anyway. It will be possible for anybody to argue, for good or ill, that if only they had been listened to in the referendum. But bluntly, we will see.
Just jump in, say something there about Scotland. The new bogeyman for Scotland will be the old bogeyman, which is Westminster. And so that's clear. But actually there is a serious issue there too, which is partly what I was getting at with, a democratic deficit, if you like. On the one hand, yes, things might go right, but we've heard from the government the other day that was forced to reveal its reasoning for not allowing a vote and having the royal prerogative. And it said quite specifically that Northern Ireland and Scotland would have no say in the process. And you have to ask the question, have we learnt nothing from the referendum? You're taking an identifiable group of people who did vote. What I know John Curtis was very good in exposing, the nuances of that, but it was, compared to the rest of the country, a strong vote in favour of Remain. And there is a danger, I think, that we can ignore those kinds of issues, those kinds of problems. And it could be a very difficult situation for us when you're not only trying to remove yourself from the EU, you're also trying to handle, the Celtic fringe, which is getting uppity again. So in terms of democracy, I think there is something quite profound here, something really, really deep. And I can imagine, as a fully signed up Scot, how people in Edinburgh are feeling right now, just hearing Theresa May on the one hand saying, I will talk to Nicola Sturgeon and make sure Scottish interests are looked after. She said that. And then we have this secret ruling which comes out saying they will have no say in the process whatsoever. That's dangerous.
Can I just add something to that? So it's not about Scotland, it's about democracy and about holding the government to account, and indeed holding the Leave campaign in some senses to account. I rather fear that that is never going to happen, because it is simply not going to be good politics for anyone to say, I told you so, if things go wrong. It may, in fact, be the case that some of the dire predictions that were made, even though they didn't occur immediately, will actually, in some senses, occur. Say that Nissan eventually closes its plant in Washington, Sunderland. Yeah, it's not really going to be possible for any politician to turn round to the people of Sunderland and say, well, look, I did say if you vote Leave, this is what might happen. And that is a problem, I think, for democracy in a way. We're not going to get that kind of honest politics. I'm not quite sure how we resolve that problem, but I do think it is a problem.
Yep.
Yes, can I go back to the historical context a little bit more? We've heard a lot tonight about how Brexit was influenced by this or that politician. To me, one of the key underlying factors is, in fact, the media. I'm speaking as a Briton who's lived in France for 25 years as a political refugee from the anti-European British at that time. Ever since Britain has joined the EU, there's been a movement of increasing strength in the media, in my view, always to see Europe as them, and never as us. I'd be interested in both of your views on how important relatively that was, as compared with the influence of various politicians and political parties.
The short answer is obviously yes. One of the things that some Conservative Remain politicians struggled with during this campaign was that normally they can count on the support of the majority of the press to deliver and amplify their messages, and they suddenly found that they were giving press conferences and putting out stories, and they weren't getting the sort of coverage from their normally supportive media that they'd been getting. But I suspect actually the more important story, and you're right to allude to it, is that it wasn't what happened in the campaign, it was what happened for years before, creating an environment in which a positive European message could not be put forward by the Remain camp because it just fell on barren ground. So I think the way in which some parts of the British press covered the story is problematic. And it certainly was a difference between this time and 1975. In 1975, the press was much more one-sided, and it was one-sided in a Remain direction. What we do about that, I don't know. Whether it would have been different, I don't know. But we have the press that we have. There was Enoch Powell once said that for a politician to complain about the press is like a ship's captain complaining about the sea. And I've always stuck to that maxim. You steer through the sea that you've got. You can't wish for a different sea.
No, I mean, I would caveat that, and I'm sure Phil will make the same caveat, that we do have to look at where most people get their political information and political news from, and it is decreasingly from the press. It is for the most part from broadcasters, which in the UK are very heavily regulated and strive very, very strongly for balance. Now, if you ask both sides, did they get fair treatment from the BBC or ITV or Sky or whatever, they will both, of course, complain that they did not, which generally seems to indicate to me that they probably did, actually. And they did their best, I think. But as Phil says, you know, David Cameron's problem really wasn't simply the press and all those, you know, years of Eurosceptic propaganda in some senses, or truth, as the other side would see it, being pumped out. David Cameron's problem was the Conservative Party in some ways. I mean, it was really very, very difficult for the leader of a party which had been beating up on Europe for, you know, the best part of 2-3 decades to suddenly execute this handbrake turn and tell people that this institution, this club that they'd been, you know, hating on for so long was actually a good thing. And really, in some ways, David Cameron and others like him reap what they sowed as Conservative politicians. You have to remember that when David Cameron first stood, I think, as a candidate in 1997, he was one of those who went against official party policy and said in his address to electors that he would, in all circumstances, vote against the single currency. You know, David Cameron, when he first became, or when he was going for leadership of the Conservative Party in 2005, promised that he would pull the Conservatives in Brussels and Strasbourg out of the EPP. David Cameron was the leader of the Conservative Party that said there must be a referendum lock on any powers passing to Brussels. So this is a man, in some senses, who never really stood up to the Eurosceptics in his party. And as Phil said, by the time he might have done or tried to do, it was just too late. If ever he was going to do it, he should have done it when he had the political capital as a new leader of the Conservative Party, when there was simply no one else who looked likely to be able to do the job. But, you know, he left it too late. You know, in some senses, you can accuse him of appeasement, and what happens if you appease? We all know.
Just on that, because I know there's other hands popping up, but David Cameron very famously gave a speech early on in his leadership in which he said he wanted the Conservative Party to stop banging on about Europe. The phrase banging on about became quoted a lot. What's less quoted is in the same speech he said, and he used an example of people out there listening to us banging on about Europe whilst they are getting on with their lives. And the example he used was taking their children to school. Now, a few years later, when he announced that, after much pressure, that he was going to have a referendum, when he gave a speech at Bloomberg, he gave it at 8 o'clock in the morning, exactly when people are taking their children to school. And on the morning of the 24th of June, when he resigned just as people were taking their children to school. There was a sort of lovely symmetry to this, and which I've always thought was indicative of how he did not want this outcome. This was forced on him. It was forced on him by people in his own party who were relentless. If you go back and look at, from the moment the Conservatives entered government in 2010 as a coalition, rebellion after rebellion on the backbenches was over Europe. They were the issues that provoked the biggest rebellions, the most persistent rebellions. It wasn't just a handful of people on the right of his party. It was the mainstream opinion in his parliamentary party was pushing him in a more Eurosceptic direction, and in particular for a referendum. And by the time you get to the latter half of that parliament, significant numbers of them were willing to defect to UKIP unless he gave a pledge. UKIP itself was polling in the European elections. UKIP topped the poll, beating the Conservatives and Labour. The first time any party other than Labour or Conservative had topped the poll in any nationwide poll since the beginning of the 20th century. These were just irresistible forces, and it may be that he was somehow wrong to do it, but I really don't see he had much choice but to do what he did.
Talking of irresistible forces, I think we've got time for one more. if you're feeling that you'd like to stand in the way of people irresistibly forcing themselves to the wine. Yes, please.
So, well, you pointed out that one of the main scapegoats may be immigrants. And we all remember there was an attack just after the referendum on Polish Cultural Center.
Yeah.
And so just yesterday I read about that if companies, British companies, they will have to declare about foreign workers. And we all know how dangerous this thinking, this mindset of we versus them is, and it has a very dangerous precedence in history. So, and we don't really know what the immigration model will be. Will it be Australian model, as Johnson wanted it to be, or will it be any other model? But how to dispel all the dangerous threats that we have, like the British society right now has about immigrants, about that. Because we talk a lot about the economy, but this is our daily life, and we know that the society is structured enough right now, and just,
Well,
this is very dangerous.
yes, I mean, it's been pointed out to Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, that some of the consultations that she says she's going to have on this, will perhaps kind of create quite a poisonous atmosphere. It's sometimes difficult to imagine how it could get any worse in Britain, the atmosphere on this. I don't expect, in fact, that will happen. She said it's just a consultation. I think she's got into quite hot water for it, and it strikes me as the kind of thing that wasn't really thought about too strongly. I think there is an argument that can be made economically, and sorry to reduce it back to the economy, that part of Britain's productivity problem is related to low wages and the availability of people who will do jobs at low wages coming from Europe. Okay, so there is somehow a link made between the availability of cheap foreign labour and the disinclination of British employers to invest in human and physical capital. I mean, I'm not quite sure I buy it. There is also some evidence, very marginally, to say that perhaps at the very bottom end of the labour market, there is, some reduction in wage rates for people because of competition from the outside. But I don't, again, really buy that. I think that a lot of the problem in the UK on immigration, in fact, isn't economic. That it is, in fact, cultural identity, and that is very much harder to tackle, I think. And I think one of the problems, for example, for the Labour Party is that its answer to the immigration issue is always economic. It's always to say if we spend more money, or if we do something about labour exploitation, or if we do all these things, it will cure it. And I don't think it will. And you asked me sort of what we can do about all this. I wish I knew. And if anybody knows, email me and email the government, because I'm sure they'd like to know as well.
Well, just 2 points. The first, and I'm going to try and respond to this in the mindset of a Leave campaigner. The first, and because I've heard this argument made directly, the attack on the Polish Cultural Centre, they dispute the nature of that attack. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's a disputed event in terms of who attacked it and why, and it's not quite so straightforward that it's an anti-immigration attack. But more broadly, let's just take the idea of hostility to immigrants, which if you are a Leave campaigner, your view on this is there is widespread concern in Britain about excessive levels of immigration. That concern has existed now for over a decade. Immigration has been the number one or number two issue on people's agendas for at least 10 years. About the only time it was not true was just after 2008 and the economic crash, when the economy, not surprisingly, shot back up. But as soon as we got over the initial shock of 2008, immigration again came back up to the number one issue. If you're a Leave campaigner, your view on this is straightforward. If people are concerned about immigration, you have to do something about immigration. And until you do something about immigration and you reduce it to levels that they're happy with, unfortunately, and they would say in no way supporting assaults, attacks, unpleasantness, you're not going to deal with them. You're going to have them because people are feeling disenfranchised, disengaged, not listened to. So from the point of view of the Leave campaign, Their argument is to say, look, this is awful stuff, but we deal with it by taking control of our borders and reducing the levels of immigration to levels that people in Britain are happy with. Now, whether we are going to get to a level that people in Britain are happy with, that's a whole other issue. And there is a lovely bit of one of the books that has already come out about the EU referendum, Gary Gibbons' Breaking Point. There is a lovely moment in it where he's talking to a Leave campaigner about discussion of the Australian point-style system, Australian-style point system. And Gibbons says to him privately, but this system just doesn't work for Britain. And the Leave campaigner says, I know, but it works as an issue. It has a subliminal message to people. They like the idea of Australia partly because they think Australia is white, and therefore, if we have a system like Australia, we will be a sort of predominantly white country and we'll be able to stop immigration. Now, the issue of what the immigration level should be, how we get there, that's another issue altogether. But wanting control of your borders in order to reduce immigration to a level that you think is appropriate seems to me a perfectly valid and coherent and non-offensive argument.
So please don't leave. We have wine at the back. But just before that, let's just show some appreciation for two fantastically stimulating, interesting speakers.